Hello there, everybody. Welcome to this latest CMU Insights Lockdown webinar. My name's Chris Cook. I am the founder and MD of CMU. We're here to help you navigate and understand the music business. We do that in a number of different ways through our daily email bulletin, our weekly podcast, our online library of guides and reports, and through training courses just like this one. Many of you tuning in today, look, there's lots of you, some people are just still arriving, are tuning in from all over the world, and some of you tuning in have been attending all of our lockdown webinars over the last couple of weeks, but I know that some of you, this is your first time. So I'm going to very quickly talk you through what's going to happen over the next 50 minutes. So basically the webinar splits into 3 sections, although the middle section is by far the longest. I'm doing a quick intro, I'm going to explain some logistics. I'm also going to talk about one of the stories in today's CMU Daily. I'm going to do that super quick today because then we go into the main presentation. And today's main presentation is a little bit longer than normal. And obviously today we're talking all about the digital pie, the money that comes in every month from the streaming services to the music industry and how it gets shared out between the labels and the publishers and the artists and the songwriters. That will take about 40 minutes, and then with any time we have left at the end, we'll do a live Q&A. So here's some logistics for you. We're in the Zoom platform. We use Zoom because I think most of you probably spend your whole lives in Zoom, so therefore you're familiar with it. But on the webinar version, there are 2 key buttons that you will find in your screen. There's the chat button and the Q&A button. So the chat button has a single bubble. The Q&A button has a double bubble. So my colleague Sam is also online this afternoon. You may see his photos somewhere in the system. He's helping me with the tech stuff. So basically chat is there for 2 reasons. First of all, if you're having any little technical queries, fingers crossed you won't, but if you do, use the chat button. Although actually, we also use it for people to say hello. This is our low-fi tech check. We just want to know you're all receiving us okay. So if you could now just click on the chat button, that's the single bubble, and just say hello. Maybe tell us where you are, because we know there's people tuning in from all over the world. We like to know where you are. So assuming that you're receiving us and you're able to hear us, if you just say hello, where you're in, that's good. They're all coming in now. Scotland, Cardiff, London, Amsterdam, Berlin, lots in the UK, but crucially lots from all over. LA, wow, you're up early. Thank you for joining us on this lockdown webinar. That's the chat button. The Q&A button is super important because if you have any questions about any of the things we cover today, click on the Q&A button. I won't answer the questions immediately, but basically once the main presentation is over, then we'll spend 10 minutes answering your questions. We may run over slightly if there's lots of questions because we are technically meant to finish at 3:20, but don't worry, we're recording this. So you'll get an email from us after the webinar, which will have 2 key links in it. Link number 1 will give you access to the slides. I'm going to show you a whole load of slides today. You can download those as a PDF and keep them. And secondly, we'll send you a link to where you can rewatch this webinar again. We're going to cover quite a lot quite quickly today. So if I go too fast, why not click on the record later and then you can watch it back at your leisure. So that's the logistical points, I think. Chat for technical queries, Q&A if you do have any questions. I'm going to get going with the presentation quite quickly because we do have a little bit more to say today. But I usually reference one of the stories in our CMU Daily Bulletin and just say a few things about it. Usually I go with the top story, but I'm not doing that today. The top of today's CMU Daily was full of copyright litigation, 3 separate copyright disputes. But lower down, we had another update on the impact of the whole COVID-19 thing on the music industry. And as we've been covering the impact of COVID-19, I mean, obviously, lots of different groups within the music industry have been impacted, and it's been really good to see the music industry rally around to try and support those people. But I suppose the big challenge is making sure that no key groups of people fall through the cracks of either industry support or government support. And I know here in the UK, the grassroots venues, absolutely crucial as a talent development channel, and so pleased we have the Music Venue Trust here in the UK, because I really feel that we didn't have that organisation that brings the grassroots venues together, because those organisations are really small, always really squeezed, they wouldn't have the voice they have at the moment. And a lot of those grassroots venues, without some support, would go out of business. And without the Music Venue Trust doing what they are doing, my theory is that by the time everybody realised that those grassroots venues were all going out of business, it would have been too late. And then when we come out of shutdown, we would have lost that absolutely crucial network. But the Music Venue Trust are doing some great work there. If you don't know the Music Venue Trust, do check them out. UK-centric, I know, but they're doing some really interesting stuff. Today, we're looking at recording studios in the CMU Daily, another group of grassroots businesses, absolutely vital, also really hugely, in some ways more so than the venues. Because, for example, here in the UK, Venues have been given business rates relief by the government to help. Studios have not. So the recording studios are in all the various different manifestations are really struggling. We have a Music Producers Guild here in the UK. They've been doing some work on that. And I feel like that is one of the areas where neither industry support nor government support as yet has really met the challenge. So it's good that the MPG are shouting about that. Obviously, similar challenges all over the world, and it's been interesting seeing trade organizations and music charities and the collecting societies stepping forward. But of course, the industry can only really do short-term stuff. And so it's really important that governments all over the world step up to make sure that long-term, the industry can come out of this. So we're not here today to talk about the COVID-19 shutdown in any detail, although it has been interesting since the whole COVID-19 shutdown began. A real spotlight has fallen on the sound recording revenue stream, the recorded music revenue stream, because with the live industry in shutdown, you have significant parts of the artist community who for whom live is their most important revenue stream. And they have other revenue streams, but the most significant revenue stream is live. Overnight, that revenue stream went away. And so people are looking at the other revenue streams. And the sound recording revenue stream, recorded music, in a way, is more immune from the impact of COVID-19 because of the way the streaming business works. It's a subscriptions business. Okay, physical is impacted. We must acknowledge that. Public performance money, the money that comes in from pubs, clubs, bars, cafes, that's affected. But with streaming, providing people continue to buy those subscriptions, and all the signs are that at the moment they are, then the core recorded music revenue stream is slightly immune. And that has reignited a debate about how that revenue stream gets shared out between all the different stakeholders. And we've had a number, certainly here in the UK, a number of artists and songwriters coming forward saying live was our big revenue stream. That's currently on hold. We know a lot of money's coming in through streaming for recordings because we keep seeing the stats. There was the IFPI report just on Monday, yet we don't seem to be getting our share of that, is what a lot of artists and songwriters are now saying. And that brings us to today's main topic. How does that money get divided up? And what are the controversies and the possible solutions to those controversies? I've pre-recorded the presentation today so that me and Sam can be here fielding your questions while that is playing. So we'll get straight on with the main presentation. So I will now ask Sam to do whatever it is he needs to do to get the presentation playing. And then we'll get going talking about how the digital money gets shared. This is the CMU Insights webinar, Streaming Explained, How Money Gets Shared. The aim of this session is to explain to you how all of the money that comes in through streaming music, by selling subscriptions and advertising, how that money gets shared out between all of the stakeholders within the music industry and the wider digital sector. So how is the money split up between the artists and the songwriters, the labels and the publishers, and the services themselves, what we sometimes call the digital music service providers, or DSPs. Along the way, over the next 35 minutes, I will explain the current system. How is the money currently shared out between all the different stakeholders? But crucially, we're going to focus on some of the issues with that system and why some people think that the current system is unfair and should be changed. And we're going to look at that firstly from a songwriter perspective. Why do songwriters and some of the music publishers they work with feel that the current system is wrong? And then we'll look at it from an artist perspective. Why do artists and musicians and their managers feel that something needs to change? At the end of the session, we'll also say a little bit about the user-centric approach for royalty distribution. How is that different to how monies are currently shared out? And what are the pros and cons of possibly moving over to that alternative approach? So that's the brief. We're going to do all of that. And today, we're going to do it in 5 easy steps. But first, before I get into that, let's just very quickly say a few things about the digital market today and remind ourselves about who it is in the music industry that the DSPs, the streaming services, actually have a direct relationship with. So first of all, let's remind ourselves that streaming is now the single biggest and fastest growing revenue stream for the global record industry. The latest stats from the International Federation of the Phonographic Industry confirm that in 2019, 56.1% of all revenues for the global record industry, this is recorded music revenues, came from streaming. That's all the different streaming services, from the ad-funded platforms like YouTube and SoundCloud and even TikTok and Facebook and Instagram, through to the more lucrative premium streaming services run by companies like Spotify and Apple and Deezer and Tidal and Amazon. So it's a big deal for the record industry. it's increasingly becoming the core of the market. And actually, the global figures are skewed to an extent by markets like Japan, second biggest recorded music market in the world, where CDs are still a big deal. For a lot of countries, actually, streaming is a much, much bigger deal than this chart suggests. That includes mature markets like the US and the Scandinavian markets, and then a lot of the emerging markets that are becoming increasingly important. So the streaming business is absolutely key to both the current and future recorded music business. In terms of the relationship between the streaming services, both the global services and then those services which are dominant in one or two markets, and the music industry, how does that work? The first thing to say, of course, is that a streaming service is streaming recordings of songs. And as you all know, as far as copyright law is concerned, songs and recordings are two different things. And as a result of that, the music rights industry, that bit of the music business that deals in copyright and intellectual property, is split into two. We have the record industry who manage and control the recording rights, and the publishing sector that manages and controls the song rights. The streaming services need to access all of that. They need permission to stream both recordings and songs. So the streaming services, the DSPs, need to have deals in place with both the record industry and the publishing sector. And it needs to make sure that those deals cover multiple elements of the copyright. What do I mean by that? Well, we can break a copyright down into its constituent parts, the different controls that copyright law provides. These 6 controls are found in most copyright systems around the world, and in the music industry we quite often use terms like mechanical rights to talk about the reproduction and distribution controls, and performing or neighbouring rights to talk about the performance and communication controls. You will notice that none of those controls is called the streaming control. So when streaming came along, we had to ask the question, well, which of these elements of the copyright are being exploited when music streams? It was decided that it was both the mechanical rights and the performing or neighbouring rights at the same time. Specifically, the reproduction control within the mechanical rights. But then, within the performing rights, a thing called the making available control, which was added to copyright in the late 90s and the early 2000s, initially for piracy reasons I won't go into today. So the making available control is how the copyright owner can control the making available of their music on demand over the internet. And in many copyright systems, including here in the UK, making available is seen as a subset of the communication control, although some people would argue it's a 7th distinct control. So the DSPs need to have deals in place with the record industry and the publishing sector, making sure that those deals cover both the reproduction element of the copyright, the mechanical rights, and the making available or communication element of the copyright, the performing rights. In terms of who it actually does the deals with, on the recording side, it's generally the record companies and the music distributors. So sometimes Spotify or whoever will have deals actually with the record companies, the majors, and the bigger indies through an organisation called Merlin. And then we have all the distributors who sit between labels and artists as well, and the DSPs. On the song side, it's slightly more complicated. We're not going to go into that today. But on the publishing side, sometimes the publishers themselves do the deals with the streaming services, and sometimes it goes through the collective licensing system, and the collecting societies do the deal. And with Anglo-American repertoire, it's usually a combination of the two. All you need to know today is it's complicated. But there's a little few facts, bits of information about the digital market today and the relationship between the DSPs over here and the music industry over here. But what we're interested in is, once the deals are done, once music is streaming, once money is coming in, how is that money distributed between all the different stakeholders each month? So step number 1, let's understand the current deals. Streaming deals are ultimately revenue share deals based on consumption share. So what happens is that when the deals are done, Spotify or whoever commits to share with the music industry approximately 70% of all the revenue it brings in through selling subscriptions and selling advertising. And generally when the maths is done to calculate all the royalties and revenues and how it's going to be shared out, each of the different products of a streaming service will be calculated separately. So the subscription money is shared out through one set of calculations, and the advertising money for another set of calculations. And actually with subscription money, often we do the maths separately for the full price service, the discount services and the mobile bundle services. But crucially, it's revenue share based on consumption share. So approximately 70% of the money that Spotify and Apple and Amazon, etc. generate is handed over to the music industry. And that breaks down approximately that 50 to 60% of the money will go to the record industry for using recordings, and then 10 to 15% will go to the songs. So what do I mean revenue share based on consumption share? Well, let's start off by looking at it from a record company's perspective. So let's say you're Universal Music. Every month, what Spotify does and all the other services do is they say, okay, how much money did we sell? How much money did we make selling subscriptions last month is what Spotify or whoever would ask. So let's say in the UK, they made £10 million selling subscriptions. The next question they would ask is, of all the tracks that were streamed to all of our premium users in the UK, what percentage came from Universal Music? What percentage were Universal Music owned or controlled recordings? So let's say it's 20%. They would then say, okay, let's take our total revenue and allocate 20% of that to Universal Music's catalogue. So with the example we're doing here, that would be £2 million. They then have a revenue share deal with Universal Music. So Universal Music would probably be somewhere between 50 and 60%, probably somewhere in the middle of that bracket. But let's say 50% for easy maths. So we had £10 million of income, 20% of consumption was of Universal Music controlled recordings. So we allocate 20% of the money to Universal, 2 million, and then rev share, we pay them half of that. They get £1 million. And then the streaming service would repeat that process for Sony and Warner and Merlin and all the distributors. That's just the recordings. They would then repeat the process for all the publishers and the collecting societies. Although remember, on the song side, once money has been allocated to songs, the publisher and society would be getting somewhere between 10 to 15% of the allocation. If we look at that from a track perspective, rather than a label or publisher perspective, for each individual track, how many times the track was played actually is irrelevant. A lot of people in the music industry have become obsessed about what the per play rate is for a stream, and therefore how many times the track was streamed and how much money that will bring in. But the truth is, there aren't really any per play rates. Yes, any one month we can average it out and come up with a per play rate for that month, but there isn't a fixed rate card. It's all about revenue share based on consumption share. So how many times a track was listened to, in a way, doesn't matter. What matters is, of all the listening that occurred, of all the streams that were serviced, what percentage were for this individual track? And obviously, for an individual track, it's going to be 0.00000000001% or whatever. But once we've allocated, or identified, I should say, what percentage of overall listening any one track was responsible for, we can then allocate some revenue to it. So of all the money that came in by selling subscriptions, or if it's the free service, by selling advertising, we then allocate that percentage of the money to the track, and then of the allocation to the track, 50 to 60% would then go to the label or the distributor that controls the recording, depending on that label or distributor's deal, and between 10 and 15% will be allocated and paid to the song through either a publisher or a collecting society, or both. And then, of course, the label would share the money with the artist, subject to contract, and the publisher would share the money with the writer, subject to contract. So that's how it works. Let's get into the controversies. First controversy, step 2 in our seminar. Should a larger slice of the pie be allocated to the song rights? As you can see, with this approximate breakdown, significantly more of the money is going to the recording than to the song. Why is that? Well, it's because the starting point when the initial deals were done between the streaming services and the music industry was the CD model. On a CD, the songwriter and the publisher always received a really small slice of the money that was generated when the CD was sold in a record shop. Why? Well, because the label incurred huge costs and considerable risks in making the recording, pressing the CD, and getting it into the record shop where it may or may not be sold. So it was always the case that on a CD, the publisher and the songwriter together were seeing a single figure percent of the revenue that was generated on the CD. So in the UK, where generally this was done through the collective licensing system, through MCPS, the MCPS rate on a CD would be 8.5% of wholesale, which equates to 6.5% of retail. When downloads came along, so the iTunes Store in the mid-2000s, the record industry proposed that we should just take the CD percentages and apply it to downloads. The songwriters and publishers sensibly objected and said, well, hang on a second, you're no longer pressing any physical product. It feels like your risks have gone down. We don't think the CD splits are fair. And after quite a lot of dispute, ultimately it was decided that the publishers and songwriters should get slightly more on a download than they got on a CD, by which I mean a few percent more. Then streaming came along, and the label said, well, we should just take the download model and apply it to streaming. And again, over a number of years, the publishers and songwriters said, well, that doesn't seem fair, because it seems like you're doing even less work on a stream than on a download. And so we saw the publishers and songwriters get a few percent more again. So it is true that the songwriters are getting actually more than double on a stream. It varies because every deal is different, and I'm not completely comparing like for like, but approximately double or slightly more double on a stream than they were on a CD. But it has to be said that if we look at some of the other revenue streams in the music rights industry, there is sometimes more parity between the rights. So for example, the money that radio stations pay, the money that comes in through the collective licensing system from radio. Now, this is an approximation, and it does vary from country to country. Obviously, in America, the labels see nothing from AM, FM radio. But let's ignore America. In a lot of countries, the money that would come in through the collective licensing system from radio is probably pretty much the same on the recording side and the song side. Sync deals. Often with sync deals, the ultimate aim at the start is that, assuming that we don't have a really famous song and an unknown recording of that song, if both the song and recording are similarly well known, then probably on a sync deal, again, we would expect a 50-50 split between recordings and songs, although because of the way sync works, actually there are additional royalties that come in on the song side. That means actually quite often the song sees more than the recording. And of course with live music, where recorded music isn't even being used, then all the money is made on the song side of the business. So it has always been the case that for different revenue streams in the music rights industry, we have different splits when it comes to how the money is approximately shared out between the song rights and the recording rights. Which poses the question, why did we go with the CD model and then increase the songwriter and publisher's rate from there, rather than starting with, say, the radio model, where we would start off with parity and then maybe the label would claim a little bit more. So these are some of the debates that are ongoing, particularly in the songwriter community. Now, we should acknowledge, and I've kind of already alluded to this, that we have already seen a little reslicing of the digital pie in streaming since Spotify did its original deals in the late 2000s. Because on the original deals, actually, the songs were getting more like 10, maybe 12% of the money, whereas on the more recent deals, particularly with the big publishers, we're starting to see the song split go up to about 15%. And that's since streaming came along. So there has been a slight reslicing of the pie already. But some songwriters would argue that that reslicing is nowhere near significant enough, and we should see a significant redrawing of the model so that, while possibly not a 50-50 split between the song and the recording, possibly a 1/3, 2/3 split that would see a significant uplift on the song side. As for each side of that debate, the labels obviously would object to that proposal. And their argument is that yes, okay, labels are no longer pressing up CDs and getting those CDs into record shops. But nevertheless, it is record labels, or companies that look like record labels, even if they call themselves distributors or label services businesses, that do most of the work to get recordings made, to market, onto the platforms, and they do all the marketing and promotion around it. There's also the fact that when you release a recording, generally there's one recording. Okay, there may be a slightly different version, a remix, but generally there's one recording. Whereas when you own the copyright on a song, there could be multiple versions of that song, all of which you're earning from. And, you know, digital streaming, and particularly sort of user-generated content like YouTube, has really seen the cover version explode. Plus, the labels would say, please not forget, the song share has already increased, you know, and almost is double what it was on a CD. The flip side of the debate is that, okay, the labels may still be doing more of the work, but their costs and risks have come down significantly since the physical era. Some people would also say, isn't streaming almost closer to radio than it is to selling CDs? So why didn't we start with the radio model? And some songwriters and managers of songwriters would simply say that songwriters have not seen the benefit from streaming, that the money they're getting from the streaming business is not on par with what they were previously seeing from their, albeit smaller cut on a CD. Something isn't working, and we can't have a music industry where songwriters are ultimately going out of business. So if we think that there needs to be a further reslicing of the pie to increase the songwriter's share, how do we achieve that? One of the challenges is that the DSPs license songs and recordings separately. They do one set of deals with the labels and distributors and another set of deals with the publishers and the collecting societies. With a CD, actually the record company was the licensee of the song. So the record company got all the money from the retailer. It then needed to get a license from the publisher, usually through the collective licensing system, and then it handed over a share of the money. If we had a system like that, what some people call pass-through licensing, so that Spotify only had a relationship with the labels and distributors, and then it was for the labels and distributors to pass the songwriters their share, then the songwriters and publishers could fight this out when they were agreeing their deals with the record companies. But that's not the way it's been set up, so that is not an option. It's also worth acknowledging that if you're a big music rights company that has both a label division and a publishing division, which all three of the majors and quite a lot of the bigger indies do too, because of the way deals work in the music industry, generally speaking, on a classic record deal, the label gets to keep the majority of the money. But on a classic publishing deal, the songwriter gets the majority of the money. So if you're a big music rights company with both recordings and publishing, you're going to support the status quo. So for songwriters, it seems unlikely that the big music rights companies, even though they're in publishing, are going to take the lead on pushing for more significant reslicing of the pie. In America, copyright law actually interferes with this anyway, because there's a compulsory license around mechanicals and there are the consent decrees constraining BMI and ASCAP on the performing rights side. Obviously, you're probably aware of this because it's quite a big news story. A thing called the Copyright Royalty Board, which sets the rates on things like this, has increased the rate on streaming. Although most of the streaming services, Apple being the exception, are fighting that increase. They would argue on technicality reasons rather than the increase itself. But it's a big controversy in the US. But even if that increase that the Copyright Royalty Board in the US instigated last year, even if that stands and the attempts by the streaming services to reform that are unsuccessful, it has to be said, all that did was it brought America in line with where Europe already was. But there is the added issue in the US that copyright law interferes. Elsewhere in the world, well, could we use copyright law actually to our advantage? Could copyright law somehow force a reslicing of the pie? I don't know. It's not really something that copyright law usually would want to get involved in. So maybe if songwriters genuinely feel that this is something that has to happen, and in recent weeks a campaign here in the UK has started to mount, then maybe it's a case of shouting loudly, appealing to the political community and seeing if something can be achieved through a combination of appealing to political figures, industry figures, and maybe also ultimately the fans. Although one more thing to say. I think it is worth asking, why are so many songwriters saying that they're not feeling the benefit of streaming? Because remember, the allocation on a stream is double or more than it was on a CD. Meanwhile, the record industry has been back in growth because of the streaming boom for 5 years now. Why aren't songwriters seeing the benefit? Is it that just the streaming business model is different, it's new, it's innovative, and there are winners and there are losers? And there are some winners within the songwriter community for whom the model really works, and they're just staying quiet as their counterparts for whom it's not working shout? Or is it that complexities in the way that song royalties are collected and processed and paid to songwriters are so complex, and believe me, they are complex, that a significant portion of the money is getting lost in the system? CMU has been working with the Music Managers Forum in the UK for a number of years now, trying to get a better understanding of all of these debates. And this is an area that we're currently focusing on. Last year, we published a thing called the Song Royalties Guide, which if you're interested in this, you should check out. And we are looking at the inefficiencies in the system, because this may also be having a big impact on songwriters, in addition to the controversy around the digital pie. So that's songwriters. What about artists? How much of this money are artists sharing in? Well, that depends on each artist's record deal. We know that 50 to 60% of the money is being allocated to the recording. How much of that actually reaches the artist depends on the deal that they have with the label or distributor which is in control of their recordings. They could be using a DIY distributor that hands 100% of the money over to the artist, or they could be signed to a record company on a really old contract they signed in the 60s and the 70s when the royalties paid to artists were terrible, like single figure percent, and they could still be getting those single figure percent on those streaming income. But if we take a classic new talent major label deal that's been signed since the mid-90s, the chances are that the artist is seeing somewhere between 15 to 20% of the money. The classic royalty on more recent deals, new talent deals with the majors, was a 15% royalty. These rates do vary from country to country, I should add. In a way, I'm giving you a UK skew here. But, you know, 15% became the norm on CDs. And then when digital came along, most labels, some proactively, others reluctantly, did increase the artist cut on a download and then subsequently a stream, in the same way that happened with the song. So a few percent was often added. So that maybe if you're on a 15% royalty on a CD, maybe you're on an 18-20% royalty on a stream. If you were stuck on a 4% royalty on a CD, maybe it's gone up to 6 or 7% on a stream. But there are plenty of artists and musicians and managers who feel that this is unfair, and that actually artists should be seeing a significantly bigger portion of the money that is allocated to the recording from their label or distributor, particularly if they're on a classic record deal where they're only seeing probably around 20% of the money. Now, labels would argue against this as well. Labels would say, a lot of these arguments are the same as on the song side, that they still take the lead in getting music to market, they still incur the associated risks. They would probably also say that music marketing is much more sophisticated now than it used to be. There are so many more elements to a music marketing campaign. Music marketing campaigns used to run for 12 weeks. Now they run for 6 months. And that means that, yes, okay, costs in terms of pressing up CDs and distributing them have come down, but the costs of marketing have gone up, a label would say. Plus, they'd point out that generally most labels are paying slightly more on a stream than they were on a CD. The counter arguments, quite similar again to on the song side, that the label's costs and risks are much lower than they were in the physical age. Managers would point out that labels these days generally sign artists a little bit further on in their career than they used to, so again, the risks are down. Plus, those labels with big catalogues have found that those catalogues have become really lucrative in the streaming age without actually the label doing a great deal of work. They just put their music up there. It just happens that with streaming, catalogue is more lucrative. Now, when it comes to artists and the split that the artists receive, I think it is worth splitting different artists up, because I think the issues are different for new artists signing deals in recent years or signing deals today versus legacy artists on deals from the 20th century, particularly the really old deals with the terrible royalties, and then session musicians who don't have those sorts of deals with the labels but who are nevertheless playing crucial roles in the recordings that we all like to stream. For new artists, you could be harsh and say, well, if you're signing a new deal with a record company and you're not happy with the 20% streaming royalty, don't sign the deal. Because there are lots of options now for artists and managers looking to get their recordings to market. And we are slowly starting to see, because artists and managers now have more options when it comes to their recordings, because distributors now work with artists and distributors now provide more services, and because managers in many cases have become more proactive in this space, there is more choice. And we're slowly seeing the commercial pressure, meaning that slightly better deals are coming on the table from certainly independent record companies and slowly the major record companies. Although when it comes to things like streaming royalties, I mean, not much. But nevertheless, for new artists, the debates are somewhat different to legacy artists. What about artists who are on record contracts from the 20th century, where the label is controlling those recordings for life of copyright, and they're getting the terrible royalties that they had to accept when they signed their deals 30, 40, 50 years ago? And what about session musicians? So let's think about legacy artists in particular. These are artists that have record contracts that don't mention streams. So when streaming came along, the record company had to take the old contract and apply it to streaming and decide what royalty to pay. So in many cases, what the labels decided to do, in most cases I would say, is to take the CD royalty, possibly add a few percent to it, and then apply it to streaming. Usually that was just done, okay? Artists and their managers were not consulted about this. If we think that that's unfair and that legacy artists at the least should be getting parity with artists who have signed new deals with the same record companies, or maybe even more, again, what could we do about that? And various arguments have been presented over the last 10, 15 years as to what legacy artists, heritage artists could do. One thing is to argue that although these record contracts do not mention streaming, they probably do talk about licensing. It was very common for old record contracts to talk about sales versus license. Sales would cover vinyl and CD and cassette, and then license usually referred to things like sync deals. And generally speaking, in those classic record contracts, the royalty on a license was much, much higher than the royalty on a sale. So some people would argue, well, what are those deals that Spotify did with the record companies? They're licensing deals. So why aren't we getting the much higher license rate? Some artists also argued that if we agree that a stream exploits the thing called the making available control in the copyright, well, that control didn't exist until the 1990s. So do record companies on their pre-1990s record contracts even have permission from the artist to exploit the making available control? And if they don't, should they not have to come back and negotiate a new deal that includes making available, which would give the heritage artist an opportunity to push for a better rate? It has to be said there were some test cases on both of these arguments. The sales versus license mainly in the US, the making available mainly in continental Europe. Although some individual artists had some success, we didn't see any big precedents being set. So therefore, neither of those arguments have really changed anything. Most heritage artists will be getting the same royalties that were set for CDs or vinyl before that in their record contracts, possibly increased by a few percent. The European Copyright Directive that was passed last year includes a thing called the contract adjustment mechanism. The idea being that creative people who enter into bad contracts early on, possibly because they're working on risky projects where nobody knows if any money can be made, could potentially renegotiate those contracts further on in order to get a bigger share of the money. It's not clear how the contract adjustment mechanism would apply to music. It's actually a movie industry principle that comes out of German copyright law. But it's something that the management community are definitely looking at as the European Copyright Directive is implemented across Europe. But could we just campaign and say, surely, if nothing else, even if we have to accept that the royalty rate on a stream, on a classic record contract is only going to be a few percent more than a CD royalty, shouldn't that 20% royalty or whatever it is be applied across the board? So that if you were on a 5% royalty from back in the day, rather than being increased to 6, 7, 8%, you get back up to that 20%. And then finally on the artist side, we ought to say something about equitable remuneration. Should equitable remuneration be applied to streams? Okay, what is equitable remuneration? Well, this comes from copyright law. In most countries, copyright law says that all performers who appear on a sound recording are due equitable remuneration whenever the performing rights of that sound recording are exploited. So remember, that's the performance and communication controls. So this operates in most countries when the performing rights, or what the record industry would probably these days call the neighbouring rights of the sound recordings, are exploited. So radio, when music gets played in pubs, clubs, bars, cafes. As that money comes into the system, half of it is allocated to the performers through the collective licensing system. And there's nothing a label can do to stop that in record contracts. That money also goes to session musicians as well as to artists, whether those are new artists or heritage artists. Now remember what I said, a stream exploits both the performing rights and the mechanical rights at the same time. So we could say, well, hang on a second, Why isn't equal being paid on streams? Because that would overcome some of the problems, because in addition to whatever royalty the artist was due under contract for the reproduction element of the stream, which might be a terrible royalty, or in the case of session musicians there would be no royalty at all, those artists and those session musicians would still get a little bit of the digital pie if there was equal on the communication element. But remember what I said. It has been decided that actually it is specifically the making available element of the performing rights rather than true communication. And generally it has been argued by record companies that ER does not apply to making available. In the UK, they're right. When making available was added to UK copyright law, ER was explicitly excluded from making available. In some other countries, it was left much more ambiguous. But this is an ongoing debate. Should performer equity be applied to streaming, either by just saying ER is due on making available as well as traditional communication, or by reclassifying a stream and saying, well, a stream is also part communication. Certainly if the stream is delivered through a playlist, it's part communication, would be one argument. Of course, if you did win the argument that ER should be applied to streaming, you then throw up some other questions. What percentage is allocated to ER? So on radio, 50% of the money goes to ER. Although on streaming, you might say, well, there's also some reproduction going on, so it isn't 50%. Is it 50% of 50%? In a couple of countries where actually it has been decided that ER should be paid on streams, actually they've gone with a few percent. But nevertheless, anything will be better than nothing. There are then some other tricky issues to deal with. Who would be responsible for paying that money? Would it be the services that would have to make sure the performers got paid, or the labels? That actually depends on how equal has been implemented at a national level in copyright law. So actually in the UK, it would be the label's responsibility to ensure that equal was paid, whereas in most of continental Europe, it would actually be Spotify and Apple's responsibility. If we did shift over to this system, so that the current system carries on, but a portion of the money, rather than going to the record companies, who then share it with the artist subject to contract, a portion of the money would go directly to the performers, which would be good news for those performers who are either session musicians, they're currently getting nothing, or performers who are on terrible old record contracts. It means they will be getting a guaranteed little bit of the money. But would there be losers in this as well? If you are an artist self-releasing through a TuneCore type service, currently you get 100% of the money. If some of that money flowed through the ER system, you'd have to share it with your session musicians, plus a collecting society would probably be doing the processing and take a commission in the process. So there are pros and cons to this approach, but it's another conversation ongoing within the artist community about how we might reslice the pie to the artist's benefit. So there you go. Song rights, should the songwriters be getting more? On the recording side, should the artists be getting more? Before we finish, I just want to cover two other very quick things. First of all, do we need a bigger pie to start with? What do I mean by that? Well, the DSP, the Spotify, the Apple, is taking about 30% of the money. And that's because that's what a record shop took on a CD. Is that too high? Should the DSP be taking less of the money? Now, DSPs to date have not been very profitable. Most streaming services are still losing money, although they are quite extravagant. They're tech companies. They spend a lot of money on their staff, a lot of money on their premises, and so on and so forth. Some people think that ultimately the DSPs should take less than 30%, although a lot of people in the music industry say 30% is probably fair, and actually pessimists think that DSPs are going to start to push for 35%, and if we're being honest, we are starting to see Spotify do that already. But then there's the other issue of, well, okay, hang on a second. Even if the DSP continues to get 30%, what if the DSP was to charge more money? After all, a Spotify premium subscription has been £10 a month ever since Spotify launched. Meanwhile, Netflix have increased their price several times. Should we not be increasing the monthly subscription for streaming? Actually, what has happened in music is, in a way, the monthly subscription has come down. Officially it hasn't, but a lot of bundling goes on where streaming services are bundled in with mobile packages, and the mobile package will ultimately see the streaming service getting slightly less money. Then there's the student discount and the family plan that further discounts the price. Plus, of course, as emerging markets become more important, the prices in emerging markets are the economic equivalent of £10, $10, €10, not the direct currency conversion. But maybe it is time that Spotify, etc. started to put up the prices. The challenge is, on the music side, all the streaming services basically have the same catalogue. So I think Spotify would be very nervous about being the first company to put its prices up. It has actually experimented with increasing the prices in some of the more mature Nordic markets, but it's not something that is currently on Spotify's agenda. And it has to be said, in the context of COVID-19, probably now is not the time to be putting up the prices on streaming subscriptions. Finally, what the hell is user-centric royalty distribution? This is the last proposal of how we change the way streaming money gets shared. So you'll remember that I said that the money gets shared at the moment by basically asking what percentage of overall consumption any one track or any one record company or music publisher accounted for. But maybe that's not the best way of doing it. Maybe we should shift to a user-centric system. Now, user-centric, as opposed to service-centric, would actually do that maths, what percentage of consumption, not across the platform, but for every individual user. So, for example, I'm a Spotify subscriber. I pay Spotify £10 a month. What would happen with user-centric is that rather than Spotify saying of all the music that was streamed, what percentage was universal music, they would say, okay, of the music that Chris streamed, what percentage was universal music? Let's say it was 20%. Okay, of the money that Chris put in, the £10, actually it would be £10 minus VAT. Of the money that Chris put in, we'll allocate 20% of that to Universal, and then we'll split it with Universal based on our revenue share. And what is the reason why that could be fundamentally different is that some people who stream are high-level streamers. They stream a lot of music. Other people who stream only stream a little bit of music. And to an extent, the latter people are subsidizing the former people on the current system. And so some people think that a user-centric approach would be a much better way of doing it, partly because actually most subscribers probably assume that that's how it's already done. But more than that, what impact would it have on the way the money actually gets shared out? Who would be the winners and losers? Now, various people have crunched the figures on this, and the general consensus is that the superstars would be among the losers. Urban music, the big genre of the moment, would be among the losers. And Anglo-American music, particularly outside the Anglo-American markets, would be losers. Meanwhile, middle-level artists, more niche genres, and those not singing in English would be the winners. And some people argue, well, wouldn't that be a good thing? The superstars, they don't need the money, but the middle-level artists do. So if this would be a way of shifting some of the money from the top down the artist hierarchy, well, that's something we should be seriously considering. There are some people who say that actually people exaggerate the impact a shift to user-centric would have. Other people say, be careful what you wish for. Not everybody in the middle level would be a winner. Some people would also be losers. But user-centric, although it's been discussed for years, has become more newsworthy in the last 12 months because Deezer wants to shift to user-centric. Now, Deezer's a smaller streaming service in most of the world, but in France, its home country, it's quite a significant player. And what Deezer is trying to persuade is for the record companies to allow it to adopt a user-centric approach just on the recording side in France as a pilot. Now, it needs to get all of the record companies on board for this, although there is support within the French political community. Universal, remember, is ultimately owned by the French company Vivendi. Deezer itself is in common ownership with Warner Music. So maybe if anyone can make this happen, it's Deezer in France. That said, you have to think at the moment that French politicians have other things on their mind other than sorting out how streaming money gets divided. But if you're interested in user-centric, Deezer actually set up an entire website explaining how it works and why they think the industry should shift to the model. And that brings us to an end of this CMU webinar, looking at how the streaming money gets shared and the various controversies with the current approach, but some of the challenges with trying to get further changes. And now I think we should go to your questions. Yes, we've got some questions coming in. We do still have a few minutes left to answer those questions. So don't forget, if you have any questions about any of the things I've said, click on the Q&A button, the double bubble, and I will endeavour to answer it. One interesting question that has come in, which is Isn't it true that unlimited uploading of songs to streaming services dilutes the revenue for copyrights overall because ultimately the streaming payout is fixed? Okay, yes, at the moment the streaming service is still in growth, but at some point the subscription growth will plateau. And so part of the problem is that there is just more music being uploaded. And that's a very interesting point. It's a conversation I was actually having with some academics last week, because here in the UK, the Intellectual Property Office has commissioned some academics to look at artist income and all the conversations that we've been having today. They're going to be investigating it in more detail. And that was one of the things that I talked about with them. Is it's kind of a harsh truth that one of the things that digital has done has removed barriers to entry. Anybody now can upload music and get their music into Spotify. And there was that stat that everyone always quotes that Daniel Ek said in an interview, that something like 40,000 new tracks are being uploaded into Spotify every day. And even if that's an exaggeration, probably 250,000 new tracks a month. The catalogue is just getting bigger and bigger. And I think because of the removal of those barriers to entry, and on one level, the fact that those barriers have been removed is one of the most exciting things about the digital age. But it is potentially the case that it was always in the record industry and in the music industry that you had the superstars at the top making loads of money. And then the next layer down making good money. And then you had a significant group of people who were just about making a living out of their music. And then below that, you had the people who couldn't get to market because of the barriers. And I think possibly what we've seen with the shift to streaming is the superstars are doing as well as they ever did. But in that middle level, there are now more people, but probably no more money. So that's one of the challenges, is whereas in the middle we had a group of artists who were just about making a living out of music, maybe now we've got a bigger group, maybe twice as big, who are not quite making a living out of music. And that's a challenge. And the question is, well, do we just say, well, that's life, that's a harsh reality of the modern world? Or do we say, no, actually, we need to do something about that? So I think whenever these conversations are going on, it's important to recognize that there are lots of different layers to it. And it may well be that the switch to user-centric wouldn't be the panacea that some people think it would be. Actually, okay, maybe a handful of artists would be better off, and Drake would be worse off. And let's face it, if we can get some money off Drake and give it to some middle-level French artists, it's probably a good thing. But it may not have the dramatic impact that people are thinking of. Even if we got the song split up from the current 15%, let's say, to 20%, would it have the dramatic impact that we think? Or are there other issues at play? The fact that more and more songwriters are appearing on hit records. The fact that in the physical era, if you wrote filler tracks on albums as a songwriter, you still got your cut of the mechanical royalties. Whereas streaming is a hit business. If you write music that isn't being constantly played, you earn zero. Meanwhile, if you write music that is being played all the time, you make way more money. So that there are various different things ongoing here. Other questions that have come in, a specific question to do with the US. The US is unusual because we have a compulsory license that interferes. Meanwhile, on the performing rights side, the consent decrees interfere to an extent. It was about something that Apple had proposed. I don't actually know the answer to the question, although it is interesting that when the Copyright Royalty Board was reviewing what streaming services paid, one of Apple's sneaky suggestions was that there are some minimum payouts in the compulsory license in America, was that the compulsory license shouldn't distinguish between free streams and paid for streams. Now, obviously, that's Apple pursuing its agenda, because Apple doesn't have a free version. Its main rival has a massive free version. So if we were to say that the system wasn't going to distinguish between free and paid for, then that would completely screw over Spotify. So they had an agenda there. But there is a fact that, because it's revenue share, and it's important to remember that when the maths is being done, the maths is always done separately for the paid for version versus the free version. So actually, once you average it out, the royalties you will receive from free streams are vastly smaller than paid for streams. And whenever you see a single Spotify per play rate that's been averaged out, it's always misleading, because it's a blended rate. It includes both the money you would get from a free service and the premium service, and they're vastly different. But that then poses the question, well, maybe we should shut down free. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why that probably wouldn't work, but it's another of the long list of debates that we should have. Okay, somebody has asked me to explain ER, or equitable remuneration. I noticed in that presentation I kept saying equitable wrong. I think it's because I was trying to say it super fast because I'm never quite sure how to say remuneration. Let's call it ER. So ER is what we call a performer right, which is a bit of copyright law that says that when the performing rights, or what the record industry would call the neighboring rights, two different ways of saying the same thing, when that element of the copyright is exploited, then the performers on the recording, including session musicians, have a statutory right in law to share in the money. And so it's not a contractual right. It's not based on their contract with the record company. Bearing in mind that a session musician doesn't have an ongoing contractual relationship with the record company, it's a statutory right. And that exists in most countries, not all countries, but most countries. And that equitable remuneration right, the ER right, is administered by the collective licensing system. So it means that with radio income, half of the money that comes in on the recording side will go to the copyright owner, usually a label, and the other half is then shared out between the performers who appear on the record. In a way, this right has existed for a long time, but it was only properly formalized in the 1990s and became a really decent revenue stream for artists and especially session musicians in the 2000s. So that is pretty established in most countries for things like radio and public performance. The argument therefore is, well, should it apply to streaming? Because remember, it applies to the performing rights, and the performing rights are being exploited in a stream. Or you could simply say it applies to radio, and Spotify is sort of a replacement for radio as well as a replacement for record shops. So that's the argument on ER. Should there be ER on streams? In most countries, there isn't, and the labels would say that there shouldn't be. But it's one of the ways that we could use copyright law in order to get a bigger cut of money for artists, or for those artists who aren't getting any money, session musicians in particular, to get them a share of the money. So that's what we mean by equitable remuneration. Okay, one last question, and then we will have to wrap up, I think. So one person has asked me whether or not blockchain technology could help with any of this, particularly with regards to user-centric model. Obviously, using the blockchain has been proposed in various different ways in digital music over the last few years, usually in connection not so much with how music is delivered or how music is streamed, but with how people get paid. And on the song side in particular, the way people get paid is very complex. We're not going to talk about that today, although I did mention it because I think it's important that songwriters realize that a portion of the money they are due from streaming probably isn't even reaching them. Now, what are we talking about? Are we talking about 20%, 30%? Some people off the record go as high as 50% of the money is not getting through. And there are clearly data initiatives that could help address that. To be fair, some societies, some publishers are very much working in that space already. So PRS are part of the ICE venture that is trying to charge this. SACEM in France is trying to do this. SOCAN in Canada has its DataClef initiative. In Latin America, we have the back office people. People are trying to address some of these issues, but maybe blockchain could be part of that solution, or maybe not. But I often think with the blockchain conversation, whether or not something could be distributed via the blockchain, the more important thing is, well, what is the something we're talking about, and how could that something work? The last thing I would say is, in terms of getting artists paid, I think it's always important to remember that direct to fan, so like Bandcamp type stuff, complements everything in streaming. And I think sometimes people maybe think Bandcamp, Spotify are their competitors. They're not. And I think that artists, for some artists and songwriters, streaming really works. That's definitely true. Okay, I know the managers and the lawyers and the accountants of those artists. It definitely works. But for some other artists and songwriters, it doesn't. But where an artist has a fan base, not all do, but where artists have a fan base, because obviously if you're if you're a songwriter who's just in the studio, you don't have a fan base to sell to. But if you are a frontline artist with a fan base, the opportunities in direct to fan are huge, and they complement everything we're talking about in streaming. It is true that the Spotifys of this world could do a lot more to help with the direct-to-fan side, and in the main, its developments in that space have been pretty half-assed in recent years. But I think, it is always remembering that direct-to-fan is another huge opportunity that digital has brought to artists that complements streaming. Anyway, our time is up. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found this useful. Don't forget, you can download the slides. We actually sent you the link for the slides in the email you got from us this morning, so you can go and do that straight away. They are up there ready to be downloaded. And then you'll get another email from us later today, with that link again, in case you're not quite sure what email I'm talking about that you've apparently received. But also we'll have a link to where you can access this recording or this webinar, the recording of this webinar, and watch it back at your leisure. That's it for today. We have a whole load more of these lockdown webinars coming up every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for the next few weeks. Tomorrow we're looking at catalog marketing, so totally different to today. But we do have some other sessions coming up around streaming in particular, and also copyright issues. We've got one I'm looking forward to, why American copyright law is a bit weird. That's coming up. So if you're interested in those, why not sign up? Do spread the word. We'd really appreciate that. But thanks for tuning in today. Maybe I'll see you tomorrow. Maybe I'll see you next week. If not, I hope to see you again very soon. Goodbye, everybody.